This afternoon, we're really talking about some of the different sorts of possibilities and things that have been happening, often prompted by the labels or people thinking about how they might be applied in different ways. So to start off, for this session around researcher responsibilities, we've got a couple of presentations, short presentations from Rose and Jane, and then Stephany's going to just moderate some Q&A with everyone around it afterwards. So, kia ora, Rose.
Can I share this on? Which keyboard am I using now? This one or this one?
The one on the right.
All right. Okay. Galangal Jali, everyone. As Maui mentioned, I'm Dr. Rose Barrowcliffe. I am Butchulla of the Waikato-Tainui Nation, which is east coast of what we now call Australia. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University, and also part of the Global Centre, or the Centre for Global Indigenous Studies, which is based out of there. I'm also delighted to be one of the global co-chairs for Enrich for 2023 and 2024. And I'm also the First Nations Archives Advisor to Queensland State Archives. So I wear a few different hats. And before I jump into it, let me just acknowledge the Te Aotearoa as the traditional owners for this country that we're on today, and their roles as the knowledge producers and controllers for this guardians of this country. So all of those hats that I wear really informs my understanding of management of Indigenous knowledges. So in my work in archives, I get to see what happens with a lot of the research data and knowledge that is gathered long after people have forgotten about it. So I think we all know that Indigenous people are heavily researched, and then materials from researchers ends up in archives that a lot of Indigenous people can't access. And there's this continual cycle, because then people go in and access records and then create new research out of that. And what we find is that's very seldom Indigenous people themselves accessing that knowledge that's held there. So one of the biggest problems we have is that there's a ton of material sitting in archives, and it's what we call orphan works or orphan materials, and that it doesn't have attribution. We don't know where it came from. We don't know who to link it back to. And that severely inhibits the ability of the original traditional knowledge holders to be able to even find that information, to be able to exercise their rights in relation to that information. So I see that in my practical work within archives, and then as a researcher, then I'm always thinking about, well, what can we do as researchers to stem the tide of these orphan works coming into archives, because it's still happening today. You'd think we would be better today, but we're really not. So that's a little bit about what I'm going to talk to you about today. So this is very much an Australian situation. Any traditional owner mob in Australia would have their traditional knowledges stored across a large number of organisations at a state and a national level. And when they're trying to exercise their rights, they have to start from scratch in each one of these organisations all around Australia that will have different processes and procedures and a different appetite for even wanting to work with those traditional owner groups. So it's very, very taxing on traditional owner groups. I know we all know this. It's very, very taxing on traditional owner groups or Indigenous communities to be able to do all of this, because we're just not resourced to do this. So when I think about responsible research, it's putting in place the small little steps that we can to make it as easy as possible for Indigenous communities to be able to find their materials and to be able to access their right to know, their right of reply in relation to those materials. So getting into a bit of archival theory here, I apologise. So this is what's called the records continuum model, which is the model that archival practice in Australia, at least, is based around. It is globally recognised, but in other countries, it's probably not as predominant as it is in Australia. But essentially what the records continuum model does is it gives us a framework for thinking about the life cycle of data or information and how it moves from its place of origin through collecting institutions. So in the very centre there, that orange circle is the create dimension, and that's really an event where something happens. So if you're a researcher, that might be when you're doing your data gathering. So in that, the decisions made in the first two dimensions, the first two circles there, are really pivotal to knowledge management rights later down the track. So in the create dimension, it's really about who you're choosing to gather data from, who you're choosing to engage with. And what we want to think about as researchers is engaging with the people who have the closest relationship with that knowledge. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in an example later. In the second dimension, the capture dimension, is when we decide to keep that data. So, you know, as a researcher, you might go out and you gather a ton of stuff, but you'll decide what's relevant to your research project and you'll keep that. And you're essentially, at that point is when you're creating a record. It's at that point when we're thinking about storing something or keeping something that we need to think about who we're giving attribution to in relation to any information or any data that we've gathered in that first phase. So those are the two key points where researchers need to be very, very intentional about their practice. In that capture dimension, what we often see, particularly with legacy data, is that researchers have simply said something like Aboriginal dances, far north Queensland. They don't mention the traditional owner group specifically. They won't give the names of the dancers if it's in a photograph, for example. None of that will be captured. The other thing that is really important to mention is in the create dimension, there's obviously that really ethical part of that, in that the people who you are engaging with, they know that you're actually gathering data from them. And I know that seems like a really obvious thing, but again, we know in the past that researchers have gone into communities and taken information out of those communities, and those Indigenous communities haven't even known that their information was being gathered. So those are the really two pivotal places. And in my research, where I've got the blue triangle coming out the side there, I'm really interested in the people, the players in each one of those dimensions, because they're really the decision makers. And what we see is often agency for Indigenous peoples. There might be some of it in that very first dimension, in the create dimension, but it decreases significantly as you move out, as you move into an organisation or an institutional level where there's basically no agency or self-determination decision-making for Indigenous peoples as that data is moving further away from the community. So the specific example I'm going to talk about is through the academic publication process. Apologies for my very simplistic graphics. I am not a graphic designer. So, you know, as I've already mentioned, we already know, past research has been very extractive. So a researcher will go into a community, will talk to a community, get the information on the data they want, go back, synthesize that, analyze that, and then they will publish or disseminate their research findings under their own name. So, of course, what happens when the researcher publishes their work under their own name with no attribution back to the Indigenous knowledge holders is that they become the copyright holder for that knowledge. And when that knowledge has not been recorded in any other way, they become the sole intellectual property owner for that knowledge, right? We've seen this time and time again, and we know this is what has prompted the development of traditional knowledge labels to try and work around that situation, which is so prevalent. So often there's no attribution back to the community, there's no benefit sharing, and even, you know, those things are bad enough on their own. But it's actually a bigger issue than that. And this is what we're seeing playing out now, because the copyright holder or the donor, the collector, is often and has often been the one that will then transfer those materials into a collecting institution. And they get to pretty much unilaterally decide how that material is described and who can access it. So it will often be stored in a collecting institution under the name of the depositor only, or the copyright holder only, not with any sort of mention of who the traditional owner group was, of where that information came from. So now, not only has there been no benefit to the community and no attribution for that community, but now the community can't even see it and find it to be able to access it. And that's the situation we're sitting with today. So, for example, Queensland State Archives, we've got 3.5 million records, over 3.5 million records that are named according to the white man who wrote it down, and communities have no idea, no way to really know what's within those records. So what I want all researchers to be thinking about is not just our research data management plans, a lot of us have to do, or even our ethics applications, because those are really short-term management plans, really, for the data. We need to be thinking in terms of generations' time. Who needs to be able to find and access this information that we are gathering today in years or generations to come? And I see there's always this assumption that something that is common knowledge now will always be common knowledge, but that disappears so quickly. And there's always, even in institutions that I've worked with where they are very open to these things, they're sort of blind to their own practices in it. So you constantly have to call it out. And one example that happened with my community was Prince Harry came to our traditional country and our elders showed him around. So we had the premier for our state. We had Prince Harry and we had one of the elders, and they took a photo, and it was stored in the State Library, who does great work on knowledge restoration for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And yet in a modern record, for the metadata on it, or the title for that record was Anastasia Palaszczuk, Premier of Queensland, so name and title, Prince Harry, Duke of whatever he was Duke of, and Aboriginal elder. Yeah, so that only happened 3-4 years ago. And it's like, come on, we talk about all this stuff all the time, but they just don't realise that this is a constant thing, that you have to change your basic practice. And we as researchers need to do that as well. We need to think about within what we have consent for within our ethics process. If we're gathering data, and I think there's been a real fear because, you know, we've gathered so much data and so many records about Indigenous people, there's a fear about being captured more, right? So some people don't want their names associated with things and they want to be de-identified. That's fine. But also think about, okay, if this piece of knowledge that you're sharing is really important to be linked to your family, then perhaps it is better for your name to stay associated with that record, because if your grandparent or your grandchild or great-grandchild is looking for you in the records, this is how they're going to find you in 2-3 generations' time. So the way one of the examples of how to do that better, particularly within a publication process, I thought I took that one out. Anyway, care principles. So really what we're trying to do is we are trying to embed the care principles in a very practical way within the process of academic publication in this specific example. So one of the ways to do that, or to improve this process, is to make Indigenous communities partners in the research in a very real way. And I mean MOUs with institutions is probably the first way to do that. And I know at CSIRO, and Cass and her team have been doing some really great work at making the MOUs much more inclusive and raising up the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. But I think it's something that all researchers can push back on their own institutions, because the default of a university is to say that the university keeps all the IP of research. But that can be pushed back on to say, no, absolutely not. Anything an Indigenous community shares, they remain the IP holders for that knowledge. The other thing is that when you are publishing, you can choose to make the Indigenous community members your co-authors on that paper. And that's actually using copyright effectively to support the ISIP rights of Indigenous people. And the reason there's a yellow circle blob thing up there is also just to recognise that even if you are working with individuals within the community and they are sharing knowledge, often the knowledge they are sharing is communally held, it's not just the intellectual property of that individual. So always being cognizant of that. And while the copyright process might not necessarily recognise that, you can write that into your papers as well and explicitly state that. Although I will say that I'm part of the Indigenous Archives Collective as well, and we just fought to publish something and we just said, no, we don't want our individual names on it. We want to publish as a collective and a collective only. So it goes to everyone in the group. And it took a bit of back and forth, but we got that to happen. Okay, so the example I want to share with that is a paper that I recently co-authored. And I guess the thing I want to flag with this is that even as researchers who are Indigenous, we can still be making these mistakes. So I worked on this paper with Leanne Wilson, who's a Bidjara woman, and she was sharing some knowledge that came from her family, and that led me to link what she was saying to an archival theory concept. So I got all excited. I'm like, this is amazing. Can we publish this? Yes, but it wasn't just her story to share, right? So we couldn't put a label on it because she was just one individual from that whole community. It wasn't her place as an individual to develop a label, and her community didn't have labels already developed. So what we agreed to do was to put a TK notice on the journal article. So even though she is from that community, and even though I am an Indigenous researcher, I'm not from that community. So there was still a process, a cultural protocol process in that we had to consider. And I'm pleased to say we were the first ever to publish an academic journal article with a TK notice. Thank you. And thank you very much to the local context team, because there were a few conversations with the editor and back and forth. It was a whole process. If you're coming to the training on Thursday, I'm going to talk more about that process of how we made that happen. The other thing we did is we backed up the TK notice with citation justice practices. So we put in the start of the article. So firstly, I guess when we wrote this article, so Leanne is not an academic. She was really nervous about publishing or writing, her writing ability. So I said, that's fine. You know, we can have yarning sessions and I will do the physical writing of it. Which in a traditional academic publication process, that would have been seen as an interview and I would have published as a single author, right? But that culturally, that is not appropriate. It's not my knowledge to assert IP ownership over this. And the reality is, without her knowledge, there would have been no article anyway. So what we did was in the main citation for the article, she's the primary author, which we know if anyone knows anything about promotion KPIs within academia, that's really important. So we put her name to the front as the primary author. But then we also stipulated that if you are citing that traditional knowledge that she shares, so we put it in the first section, very clearly delineated from the rest of the article. If you're citing specifically that knowledge, you have to cite her inside of that paper. So again, it's making it very clear that I am in no way asserting any sort of IP ownership over this knowledge. It belongs to Leanne. So we published that earlier this year, and I'm also very happy to report that we found out we've just won an award for it. Australian Society of Archivists have just awarded us the Sigrid McCausland award for it. So yeah. Okay, so within the publication, just to reiterate, as a responsible researcher, you should always be thinking about attribution. Always name the people who are sharing the knowledge if you have their consent to do so. And you might need to explain the pros and cons of that so they can make an informed decision. I really believe that co-authorship and using copyright cleverly is a really great way to go. And if you're in the hard sciences, you can have like 100 people on a paper. So why not? Name them all, I say. And then using citation justice practices, so you can Google that, but that's about the syntax of how you put together a citation. So you will have noticed, I think on the previous slide, we put our cultural affiliations, our tribal affiliations in there. So that's part of citation justice practices. And then the last part of that, but definitely not insignificant, was then you can also add disclosures and labels if the community has them to those publications. I will say, obviously, it depends on who you're publishing with, and we were lucky to be working with a very receptive editorial board and editor who were totally open to everything we were suggesting, and we had meetings with the local context crew to be able to advise what needed to be done to make it happen. There's also things you can do outside of the publication, around the publication, that's advocacy work. So again, working with the journal editors, it had really helped that the journal that we publish in is open source and they self-publish, so they can make those decisions themselves. But obviously, if you're going with one of those big publishing houses, they're going to be a lot more rigid. But I think you don't have to be with the really stodgy big ones. There's still you can publish anywhere. Same. I've also done that. Had similar conversations with conference review panels and peer review panels, and explaining to them that the application and notices and labels, if it's done right, is part of the, you can tell that the work's being done authentically and well, and as in partnership with communities. So the labels and notices can really help with the peer review process, because we know that researchers will often put in there, yes, I'm consulting with the community, and but there's never any sort of follow-up with the community to see if that's actually happened, right? But if the community has a profile on the hub and there's a project in there, then you can actually verify that the researcher has worked with the community. So part of that, and I'm not sure if they've actually done it actually, but that journal was creating their own profile on the hub as well. So then we get to add them to that project. So it's in there that we have collaborated on this process. Yeah, that's me. I'm doing name.
Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to see so many of you here and staying after lunch as well, which is particularly impressive. My name is Jane Anderson. I am one of the founders of Local Context, but I'm not going to talk about local contexts. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of these researcher responsibilities and the different kinds of transformative work that can happen when you start centering Indigenous interests at the beginning of research projects, and the different kinds of changes that have to happen at institutions, the different kinds of agreements that need to get put in place and things like that. Before I do that, though, I do want to give a huge shout out to some of the Local Context team who have put this together, who haven't yet been acknowledged within this space. I want to do a huge shout out to Kuri, to Jeanette, to Ashley, to Katie Lee, and to Natalie. And Natalie's somewhere on another call at the moment, but I just wanted to thank you all for all the work that you've done to kind of bring us together today. I'm also a stand-in, so my slides are, I'm going to talk for a short period of time. I'm 2 minutes. Yeah. I'm a stand-in for Libby Liggins, and Libby is an incredible colleague of ours and couldn't make it today for health issues, so I'm just kind of standing in for her. So I wanted to talk about this project, which is the Centre for Braiding Indigenous Knowledges and Sciences, which is the first Indigenous-led project that's been funded by the National Science Foundation in the United States, $30 million. And this was just funded in September. It has over 50 communities that are involved in this project and at least 30 different institutions. There are regional hubs in Australia, in Canada, in the United States, and here as well. And just kind of what this project is trying to do within what is kind of like the sciences is recognizing and valuing Indigenous knowledge in a way that probably hasn't been valued within the National Science Foundation federal funding context previously. So but what's interesting about this project is not only it's kind of an international network of scholars, majority Indigenous scholars, which is kind of what marks it as such a significant project as well, following Indigenous values into how the research is being created, the partnerships with communities from the very beginning. But one of the kind of major challenges that we had at the beginning of this work has been, how do you deal with existing funding agreements to universities that vest the ownership of the intellectual property with the researcher, not with the community? So one of my jobs, and Maui and I are co-leads of the Data Sovereignty Working Group, which is kind of embedded within this particular project, was to kind of rewrite those agreements to include Indigenous intellectual and cultural property and data sovereignty and ownership of Indigenous communities' data to vest with the communities themselves. So we kind of rewrote these agreements and then sent them out to all the universities going, oh, they're not going to sign them. Will they read them? I don't even know if they read. Anyway, the point being, all the universities signed them, sent them back to the University of Massachusetts, where this now is. And then we have had to kind of rewrite an entire new intellectual property and data sovereignty agreement that matches or changes the National Science Foundation's actual standard template for any federal grant that is provided. So it's a huge institutional shift that kind of means that Indigenous rights at the very beginning of this project are recognised and built into the function not only of the project, but the function of the institutions themselves. So changing the obligations and the responsibilities that the institutions have for communities and protecting Indigenous data. I think Rose said it so perfectly. Thinking about who is this data for the next 7 generations, and making sure that communities are named properly, but they also have ownership, governance, and control of that data as well. So this is just kind of this project, and I wanted to bring it to you, and I am very short because this is all it really is. The kind of project is kind of set up around climate change, around archaeology, and around Indigenous foodways, kind of linking those kinds of pieces together. There are these thematic working groups around relationality, data sovereignty, fieldwork practices and braiding Indigenous knowledges, story work and knowledge mobilisation, formal and informal science education, training Indigenous scientists, and also transforming policy and government agencies in relationship to Indigenous knowledge. It has regional research hubs that I mentioned, but also it's creating this kind of knowledge base. And so some of the next stage of the work that we're doing is what goes into this knowledge base? Who makes decisions about what knowledge goes into that knowledge base? How does knowledge that's in that knowledge base become findable, accessible, travel across different kinds of data systems? How is it tagged? How is it labeled? How are those interests recognized and set up from the very beginning? So many of these problems that we've kind of been trying to deal with and kind of create different kinds of interventions in to kind of shift and change are not repeated in a project like this. So kind of it takes a lot of people to kind of do those things, but it's kind of amazing that it's actually got funded. And in a project like this in the United States, you have to go through a site visit where you have to get grilled by about 10 experts in relationship to the work that you're kind of putting forward. In this project, it was a bit of a challenge because all the Indigenous researchers are in this project and they couldn't find enough Indigenous other researchers to kind of do, so that was very challenging for the National Science Foundation. But what was interesting, so it's a full day. You have to sit there for a full day and answer every single question that they can come up with to kind of undermine why you shouldn't be getting this grant. And what they ended up focusing on for 80% of that day was on intellectual property and data sovereignty, which we actually had answers for. So just kind of like the ways in which some of these spaces are changing to be differently attentive to where Indigenous interests must sit and have answers to, not just in the data management plan, but actually core to the project itself, kind of speaks to the possibility of change that might be happening within some of these spaces. So that's all I'm going to talk about. That's all I wanted to talk about. Rise, come back.
You guys go down there. You can use that there.
So I'm going to ask a question first. This is, as an Indigenous researcher and as somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about how do we do research in ethical, responsible ways. This is really exciting, so thank you both. One of the things that I think about a lot is that research has to be relational, and not just in relationship, but also reciprocated. And so I wanted to ask you both, in these contexts and thinking about doing this in big ways, how do we still center relationship, and how do we still make sure that the work is reciprocated, and it's not obviously not extractive. That's exactly what you're saying not to do. But how do we ensure at this scale that we do that relational work?
Make the community part of the research team. Like make them RAs or CIs chief investigators or research assistants, or give them paid jobs and equal benefit sharing, like as the care principles indicate, within the research project. But also the project needs to be something the community actually wants, right? So it's not like we don't have methodologies, like non-Indigenous methodologies in this space. Like participatory action research is exactly that, where you work with the community, develop the research questions, and then come up with a way to deal with that. And it's an iterative process where you're constantly checking in with the community, or they're integrated or integral, I would say, to the research project. So it's not groundbreaking, right?
Yeah.
We just, again, I think it's that fear of losing control from the institute, that, well, if you make the community equal participants, then, you know, can we benefit as much from it as, yeah. So I think it's very doable, but it just takes more Indigenous researchers in the institute to do it properly.
Yeah, and I would say in this project as well, that was kind of central, which is why there's a working group on relationality. And kind of the first meetings have been, unfortunately, because it's so enormous, and this is like one thing about when you have enormous projects that are across multiple countries, across multiple time zones, how do you maintain those relationships, and how do you build new relationships, and how do you keep coming back to make sure you're checking in that the project is actually serving the community in the way that it was kind of created or co-created. And I think they remain particular kinds of challenges. But it's also being attentive to things that don't necessarily look like research, but are exactly what people need to have, like whether that's resources, whether that's making sure that the agreements or different kinds of protocols are in place, different kinds of responsibilities that sit there. I'm a non-Indigenous researcher, just my responsibilities are always forefront of my mind in relationship to what's possible and what change and what people want to see and what people want to, and the listening that's required.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm just wondering, Jane, in the center of, I forget what it's called, it's center,
CBICS,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, is there training? Because I do think the next generation, of students and so on need to know all about what Rose talked about and lots of other things, right? And I was just wondering what your plans were for that. And of course, subversively, you can kind of train even their supervisors as you're training them, the graduate students. Even if they don't know that they need it, they need it. Right?
Yeah.
Just was curious what you're thinking.
Yeah, training. Training's a huge component of that grant. And I think what's also been interesting is seeing how graduate students are normalizing that this is kind of core to their work. And I'm seeing graduate students teaching other graduate students that this is not a side issue. This is actually like how they have to, their entire worldview must change in order to kind of center these questions of ownership, of attribution, of collaboration, of reciprocity. And some of these tools that we kind of have created are actually, they're teaching them to other students as well. And that's kind of, for me, when I see that happening, I think that we might also have reason to be slightly positive about those kinds of changes. And it, welcome, Lang. It might not think that there is a kind of a shift, a groundswell of shifting that's happening, not only in the humanities but also in the sciences. That this project, right, recognizing that Indigenous knowledge is actually a legitimate part of science is science. And then there's so many projects that get produced and communities go, well, yeah, we knew that. We just have to do this science to make you comfortable with what we already knew. And kind of how you shift and change the kind of mentalities about what even research is, what it looks like, and what it has to have around it to kind of count and be legitimate. So kind of teaching students, the training piece is a huge component of that.
Anyone else?
Kia ora koutou, thank you so much. I have a question about open source journal articles and what your experience with them is. Obviously, you found it easier to work with them to get your research out, but is there any thinking on whether they're better or good for Indigenous communities? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
I definitely think open source is better for communities or anyone who's done academia, right? If it's behind a paywall, then what use is it to a lot of people? I will say that I'm really fortunate that I tend to work with really good people. So, but I know that's not always possible, and depending on what field you're in, it might be a different level of receptiveness to this. Could we maybe talk a little bit about the conversations we've had with, I've got drawn a total blank, not Scopus, Awkward.
Oh,
Thank you. So, sort of as part of that process, we started, and there are ongoing conversations with Orchid. So anyone who's within the academy, and Catherine will speak about this a bit more, maybe. Orchid is one of those platforms that links academic profiles around the world, and there's a way that you can verify that people are doing what they're doing, I guess. So Orchid is actually incredibly open to having TK notices and labels within their platform. We just got to figure out how to do it.
it's a tech question.
Yeah, it's a technical issue, but there's 100% a will to be able to do that. And I think when you see an organisation like Orchid implement that, then I think you're going to see a lot of publishers be like, oh, well, we need to update to keep up with that. So I think there's always people who are willing to go further and to push the envelope, and the stragglers will catch up. Like, I don't necessarily think we need to put our energy in trying to get the really recalcitrant ones to catch up, right? They'll do that in their own time, and maybe unless they've missed the boat. Work with the ones where you're getting the most wins, I would say.
Yeah, and just on the kind of, like, I agree, like, open source means, like, hugely different access, and not having to pay for an article. I mean, one thing that we did, James and I worked on this memorandum of understanding between the University of Maine and the Penobscot Nation many years ago now. One of the things that we had to write into that was that the Penobscot Nation would have access to the library and to JSTOR and to Hacker Trust to get access to journals that the community needed to do their own research projects. But otherwise they didn't have access to them. And so kind of that's that kind of, where are the barriers to access? What does that look like? Who is the audience? Different kinds of privilege that sit within different kinds of academic contexts. But this kind of Orchid piece is really interesting if you kind of trace the lines between changing and transforming academic practice and research, and how do you incentivize researchers to also have their ethics more visible? And actually disclose the work that they've been doing with communities so that their peers can also see that that work has taken place. It's really, really important. So kind of getting that into Orchid, or getting the notices and the labels into Orchid, is a really big kind of component of transforming that kind of research system for transparency, actually.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. And there was one other thing I was thinking about. The publishers. That change is happening. I mean, we just had a huge meeting with international publishers from Springer and Taylor Francis, to kind of thinking about how do publishers become operationalized and compliant with the care principles. And what does that look like? And there's this like phase 1 of a phase 3 work that we're going to do with them. But they're all kind of sitting there waiting to be told what that next step is, and these are the next steps. So we were able to talk about Orchid, we were able to kind of talk about Rose's work with the notices, demonstrate that that change is possible from a publishing standpoint, and get some of these big publishers like Nature, like Science, actually doing these disclosures about, if you have to disclose where the data comes from, you have to disclose that it's coming from Indigenous communities. And that's like going to be standard requirement in all publishing in the future.
As it should be.
As it should be. So seeing those spaces is kind of shift is also, but you have to kind of help people get there.
Can I ask a question? Has anybody given any thought and interest in your thoughts to retrospectively doing this somewhat?
In publication?
Yeah. So you go to Sage and go, guys, what's going to be the approach to retrospectively fit this stuff or stuff that has been published? Because maybe it's some of the answer in the past or what you want to do in the future.
Well, I think that the next question to that is finding Indigenous data. And it's an enormously difficult problem if it hasn't been categorized properly, if it's missing names, if it has miscategorized. You've got a whole, you need, I mean, it's not that I haven't thought about this for for a chunk of time. And the same kind of sits there with publications as well. How do you retroactively go back to correct the record when the record kind of presumes that it's correct to start with?
I would. I guess microphone ever. I would say you do that by publishing and using citation justice. So you can use existing publications, and in your publication, you can say whether your research, you know that this has actually come from this community, and then you can assert a label or a notice on that in your publication. But then, so one piece of work that I did with the Indigenous Archives Collective earlier this year was a citation guide for Indigenous knowledges. And it was exactly looking at those scenarios where we know Indigenous knowledge exists in publications, but where it hasn't been attributed. And then how do you pull that out in the citation? So you choose to cite the community in Brown et al., whatever it is. So there's advocacy and activism work that you can do as individuals without waiting for, say, a large publishing house to go and do the work. There's things everybody can do as an individual, I would say.
Okay, one more question. Well, move on.
Kia ora, congratulations on being the first team to put the notices onto the publication. Fantastic, well done. My question, I'll try and be concise, is so publications is one form of output from research. I'm just wondering, there are other forms, obviously, other short forms of reports, or there are presentations, things like that. Have you given much thought with your test case to acknowledging the local context in other forms of other communication tools that or outputs that come from your research?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had much of an opportunity with that particular publication. We're actually, I think like the award ceremony presentation for that will be the first opportunity, which is happening December 14th. We're obviously, because that publication is noble because it's the first, right? So by default, we would be talking about the TK notice anyway.
Yeah.
I think the thing is, when it's normal, then do you pull it out and talk about it, or do you not? I think the beautiful thing about the labels and the notices are that they are visual, right? So they're super easy to put on a PowerPoint slide.
Yep.
And once they become normalized and people recognize the iconography of it, it gives, it gives instant recognition without necessarily having to go into a long discussion about what each notice or label might mean. I mean, ideal situation, people will recognise them instantly and know that there's something there.
Yeah. Sorry, two-part question. I'll just get it out. The other thing too, because publication is obviously for a very specific audience, and that audience is not necessarily our people, our community. So, and I guess as you say, with the normalising of it, and with just filling the world full of labels, there'll be kind of less and less of the need for that. But more importantly, it is about how the communities are engaging with research to produce these kinds of things. So, I think you've highlighted that really well in terms of the linkage between communities and the researchers and sites. But there's a lot more work to be done in putting this type of research and work in front of our own people, being able to communicate the work that we do. To our own. So, but these are all fantastic steps along the way. So, well done.
Thank you.
All right, thank you
No, does this need to go off?
No, just put. Kia ora. Thanks. Okay. Moving on. Next one. One more.
Got it,
There you
yes.
go. Ah,
Oh.
see, and that's why I don't want you to talk so much, Taoho, because you're next.
It's my time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so look, thanks for that. It's really good to see the ways in which the labels either prompt action or there's actions which they can reflect. So the action's already, the change is taking place, and then the praxis is just being reflected in a different sort of way. But we just really look at these couple of sessions that are going to be talking about future possibilities. And so just inviting Taoho and Kandy and Katarina to come and do their talks. Yeah. Nice. Kandy, looks like you're first.
Tēnā koutou katoa, and to everyone joining us online, tēnā koutou katoa. Today I'm going to talk about identifying content for safe transmission. I'll outline 4 things. Who is Tohu Media? Why we exist, how and what we do. Firstly, Tohu. For us it means labels, digital fingerprint, preserve. So who is Tohu Media? Introducing my nannies. They are who I do this for. They had a friendship of over 60 years, and they created and sold traditional weaving products around the world. This was back in the 1960s and 70s, to fundraise for education grants for me and my cousins. My nanny on the left, she became an expert weaver for our people and her weaving throughout our ancestral meeting house. And she also wove our korowai, our traditional cloaks, which hold equal mana as waka. And the nanny on the right, she would be to my elders what Jane is to local context. She reached out to our people back in the 1960s when it was a time when there wasn't much empathy for our people post World War II. So they also fundraised to create our marae, our cultural meeting place. I wanted to learn the history of our marae, and so my parents were involved in building it, and so my nannies passed on several treasures, including an archive collection. A few reports have been collated on that collection, which led to a wāhi tūpuna classification with Heritage New Zealand. Wāhi tūpuna is a place of ancestral significance because so much came out of this little building. It gave birth to our marae. And so now I face the challenge of how do I safely transmit my nanny's story to future generations in this digital era. The problem is it's not easy to search and retrieve video content or content that hasn't been digitized. It makes it hard to identify for digital fingerprinting and therefore hard to preserve. So the solution, Tohu Media, exists to empower owners to tohu their video content so their stories are valued. How? With easier digital fingerprinting. We have been identifying content for 14 years for mainstream film and television producers. And what this enables them to do is to export their content globally. And we want to make this possible for Māori. Second is accurate labelling with the help of local context. And third, we're using a local cloud provider. For us, that's Catalyst Cloud, because they come under New Zealand law. And they've given us a development grant to build what we do. We are developing an AI-powered software to create visual transcripts of everything you see and hear on screen, which means ideally faster search and retrieval of archives, easier ID of traditional knowledge and rights holders. And when you know who holds the rights, you can preserve and payment is triggered. So to demonstrate this, I would like to show 4 AI models on the film They Returned Home, courtesy of Local Context.
Our journey goes back thousands of years, from when our ancestors first voyaged to this land, through generations of whakapapa, up until the present day. Where technology has the power to give a voice to those who have been silent for far too long. Imagine a world where we lead technology not just for innovation, but to protect and preserve the stories and knowledge of our ancestors. And to think that it could all start with a single step. Our user-friendly interface allows you to upload video with the click of a button. Then up into the cloud it goes to interact with our 4 AI models. It's designed with the goal of empowering our communities to hold on to data sovereignty. First, our facial recognition model recognizes the speakers. It identifies who is speaking, ensuring that voices are attributed to the right people. Second, our audio transcription model is hard at work, transforming spoken words into written transcripts.
We have this real thirst to control, to collect, and be in charge of how our culture, especially our language, is managed for our community's well-being.
Third is our on-screen text model, ensuring that no text is forgotten. It captures any text on the screen, able to preserve our stories, legends, and knowledge for future generations. Fourth, our label recognition model, designed to recognize and promote the usage of TK labels, ensuring that Indigenous communities have the tools they need to protect their knowledge and hold on to data sovereignty. All of these Taoho AI models are held together by an API. Together, we can lead the way, ensuring that our cultural taonga are protected, celebrated, and led by us, not by the technology giants. We stand at the crossroads of tradition and technology, but with software like ours, we can bridge the gap, empowering our communities to control their own narratives, protect their own heritage, and thrive in this digital era.
I just wanted to always acknowledge the footage and audio that we use. And so Taoho Media is more than a company. We have a duty of care to accurately label, fingerprint, and preserve our stories so they are valued. One more thing. We are calling on funders to help us engage with Māori to accurately label, digitally fingerprint, and preserve our artworks on screen. And to demonstrate with object recognition, working with TK labels.
This video is a demonstration of our object recognition model being trained to recognize Indigenous objects with TK labels, such as this basket. This is invaluable in labeling Indigenous taonga and arts.
So you may have noticed that our AI misidentified the TK label as community voice, as Jane is nodding to me, which highlights the importance of accuracy. So I did deliberately keep that in to show why that's important, and so we have corrected our model to make sure that that is accurate next time. Another potential use of object recognition is being able to identify, for example, a portrait of an ancestor in the background. We want to be able to identify and track its use. That's the potential. To close out, I would just like to thank our funders, our academic institutions, and our collaborators. We are testing with Radio Ngāti Parau. And finally, to my business advisor, Havoc and Harmony, and to my Taoho Media tribe, who are probably watching online, Nation, Sean, Sander, and to our Callaghan Innovation Consultant, Danny. And finally, to my whānau, present and online, ka aroha koutou. It's Taoho our media.
Right, I really should have orientated myself with this earlier in the day. That's there, that's there, that's there. Ka pai. I operate with this one. This one, ka pai. Thank you. Tēnā tātou. Nā rauranga tira mā a tēnā koutou katoa. Tuatahi, ki tō tātou matua nui te rangi. Nāna nei ngā mea katoa tēnā koe. Ki ngā rātou mā, ko wehi ki te pō, moi mai rā. Tōroa, ki te iwi konei, te Aotearoa whānui, ki Taranaki, no reira tēnā koutou katoa, engari i o koutou e huihui mai nei a tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Taoho Patuawa hau, he uri au no te Roroa, Ngāpuhi, Ngāti Whātua. Kia ora everyone. My name's Taoho Patuawa. I am here today to obviously provide a little bit of my context with local context. So firstly, my background is in marine science and aquaculture. So I born and raised, I'll do a quick background, which could get derailed and go on for a while, but sorry, no. I'm born and raised in Australia. I was born and raised in Newcastle, and I did all of my schooling over in Australia, and including all of my years at university, where I did a Bachelor of Science degree at the University of Newcastle, and then a Masters of Applied Science down at the University of Tasmania. Both my parents from the same little town, right in the middle of the rohe there, in a little town called Kahu. So they would always bring us home. So I always knew and always had a connection to where home was. And after I moved back from Australia in 2004, I moved actually down here to Wellington. I worked around at Niwa for the mighty environmental research team there called Te Kua o Taihoro Nukurangi. And really I was jumped in there and got myself immersed in as much of the science stuff that I could get stuck into. I wasn't never really destined for academia or anything like that. My interest really is about applying science. I think science is a very important role in informing us, in helping us make sound decisions in terms of management, and that's kind of how I've created a little bit of a niche for myself, and that's kind of my primary role within my iwi organisation, which I'm very fortunate to be working for. The iwi organisation is Te Roroa, so we've been settled since 2008, and through years and years of work, all the work that gets done before settlements and things. I had somewhat of an understanding of a lot of this work that was going down. I knew that we were very active with a lot of different projects around our rohe, particularly within the environmental spaces. And one of the things that I found when I first came to work for the organisation was, where are our records of all of this work? Where are our records? Where's our knowledge? And it just simply didn't exist. So there was always kind of this niggling thing in the back of my mind about that particular challenge, and kind of putting that into the context of how do we turn that around? How do we maximize what we get, and how do we acknowledge the contribution that we make towards these projects, environmental projects? So that's kind of where I base my work around. So as I said before, this is just a picture of our rohe. So we're based on the west coast of Te Tai Tokerau, between the Kaipara harbour. So the southernmost landmark is Tokotoka Maunga, and then up to Aotearoa, which is in the southern headland of the Hokianga harbour. This is our tohu, just speaking of tohu. This is our tohu here, the two manaia. So the black circle in the middle indicates Te Kuri. And the two kind of concentric rings outside of that indicate Te Pō and Te Ao Marama. The two manaia are our two eponymous ancestors, Manu and Rangi Taua Waro, his Taina, and they are sitting in between Te Pō Te Amarama to represent that connection between the past and the past, present, future. Yeah, so that's a little bit about Te Roroa. So just in terms of the context, I've just sort of borrowed these slides from another presentation I did over in Australia. So, you know, really, one of the things I'm really interested in building our capacity and our capability to design and lead strategies and actions for the protection of cultural landscapes and the native biodiversity within our rohe. And I think, you know, one of the things that we need to be mindful of really too is that understanding that threats and impacts are pretty consistent across the motu, but it is the local contexts that are uniquely specific. That's the things that drive our priorities. These are the things that we may be more aware of and we may be more tuned into because they mean, you know, more to us. But yeah, it's really, I don't know, I just like that point, you know, we're all kind of, we're fighting against the same things in terms of the preservation of our biodiversity, you know. And as kaitiaki, we need to be able to broaden our ability to assimilate and apply knowledge to achieve positive and transformative impacts. So yeah, being able to use knowledge systems, being able to use tools to create the change that we require. Not one to be immune to the development of good kind of design slides. Here's mine. I just threw this together for a presentation I did over in Perth last year. But it's kind of the way that my mind works and the way that I kind of think about working in the environment, really. Knowledge systems of nature and natural processes. Obviously, you know, there's a very strong localized as well as generic, you know, aspects of traditional knowledge. But there are also the science approach. But really, you know, what the role that we play within operations within our iwi organization is really how do we look at these strands and how do we apply this knowledge to get some outcomes such as behavior change and ecosystem resilience. And those are pretty key to, it's a pretty key little model really to how I like to engage in my 2 minutes. I've only got 2 more slides. Kept it nice and small. Sorry, last slide. This is it. This is my last one. So yeah, I just really wanted to give that background about sort of who I am, how our organisation works. But then, you know, we've got this this actual example, which is hot off the press. It was really only completed, I think, last week. And this is tracking eDNA use as a biodiversity monitoring tool within the rohe of Te Roroa. So eDNA is becoming a more, obviously a more well-known, well-used tool in terms of biodiversity monitoring for various reasons, biosecurity incursions, and just, you know, general, well, for the identification of threatened species and things like that. And so we have some projects going on, and sort of, so we were an early recipient, or yeah, I guess a recipient. We weren't really contributing to Aaron's work at Manaki Whenua, but the thing to me, I could see some synergies between the Manaki Whenua collection and exactly what, you know, the Wilder Lab model is doing. So what we've tried to do, I haven't tested this too. There's a link on there. Is this going to work? We'll see. We'll just push the link and see what happens. Looks like it wants to work. Oh, right, it works. So this is obviously the link back to the project. So so this is the project in the system, and I've included the link here. So this is the link directly to, and this is just a kind of a template that we've worked with Sean and Amy. Amy, are you here? No. Okay, so we worked with Sean and Amy from Wilder Lab to put together a test a pilot, if you will, of what this might look like on their report. So obviously the DNA, the sample results, the sample goes to the lab, they analyze the results, and they come up with an output. Within that, they have their own system for that. And so this is attached directly to that output. So just to show it sort of working. So that's the batch sample report for a particular thing. This is obviously still a work in progress, but like kind of some of the steps that are in place. All finished kind of last week. So for those unfamiliar with the eDNA sample reports, again, visual report card. So these are some of the things that have come out from the sample collection. Real simple explanation. eDNA, do I need to explain it? No, good, excellent. Glad I got out of that one. It could have got me into all sorts. But if you have a look at that, if you have a look at the type of information that they can get out from it, it's not just what you see. There's a lot there. So again, this collection, this is kind of using that genetic information, linking it up. And obviously, we work very closely with Department of Conservation, Northern Regional Council, NPO, Biosecurity New Zealand, to really trying to be aware and be mindful of things that are happening where these techniques are being used. Originally, we were going to really dial down into a project-specific thing, but then that would mean multiple projects using the same labels. So overcome that was just to really look at. There's still a little bit of work to be done really, but looking at the use of this methodology across the Roroa and being able to keep that tracked all together in one project together. So that's kind of the angle that we've gone there. That's it. That's it. Yeah, you got it from here.
I got it.
I hope I didn't break your system.
No problem.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. It's very short.
While this is coming up,
Yes.
This is a great time to share great ideas. So I really want to thank Jane for turning my linear thinking into a circle. And I guess this is what local context is all about, changing linear ways of doing things to more holistic and circular ways. So I'm going to sort of carry on a little bit from Kandy and move into the commerce space, but tuatahi. Ko hikaroro te mauka, ko araituru te tai, ko waikoiti te awa, ko kaitarua hiki te hapu, ko kaitahu te iwi, ko pukataraki te marae, ko Katarina ahau. So that's our beautiful marae of Kati Huirapa ki Pukataraki, which is in the deep south. So I'm here with two of our rangatahi or rakatahi, so Levi and Rohina. And I brought them with me deliberately because it's not about me, it's about our next generations and the 9 to come after them. So I always start here though, because although I'm associate professor at the University of Otago, all my thinking, all my theory and all my work is founded on something really fundamental, and that is place. Place, moana, the sea, the ocean, the sky, the plants, the people, and the things within that. So it's a very material view. So even though theory and what we're talking about often seems very immaterial, it seems in the cloud or it's digital, actually so much of what we do is actually located, hence local contexts. And I have to keep coming back to that. Otherwise, I go off into this cloud land and stay there. And I think as an academic, it's really easy to do that, but actually we must root ourselves in our communities. So here are some of our activities, some of our environment, but also some of our products. All right, so this is why I'm going down this route. And the basis of this product is that one of our young members there and what looks like a really prickly plant, and it's called taramia, and we've turned it into a perfume. Okay, now that all sounds fine and good. However, this is a reflection on that process and where local context is taking these types. This is only an example, but this could apply to anything. So for me, grounding Indigenous rights in the local context is really about this. To me, it's about creating an infrastructure. And that infrastructure is in the traditional knowledge labels and the biocultural labels establish Indigenous cultural authority and governance over data and collections by adding provenance. And provenance is the area that I'm really trying to explore and think about. And that's a piece of work I'll be doing, hopefully with these young people here, but also in some work that I'll be doing as a result of the Enrich Global Chair, which a partner over there is Rose. Some of the work that I'm really hoping to think about in a more commercial context. So to me, this is an infrastructure that allows us to do particular things. It's a way of thinking. It's both an infrastructure, it's actually a thing, but it's also a way of thinking through some of the issues when Indigenous things, actual things, but also the imagery of things or the data about things travels. And more of this work is being done in this working group with the IEEE, which is the International Electrical something. It's to do with the computery people, right? That's how I think about it. The recommended practice for provenance of Indigenous people's data. So this has been going on for maybe 3 years, roughly, but it's a standard setting body. This is actually really important because setting a standard globally, and although this is about research, as someone else said before, though it starts there, it's like, well, the latecomers suddenly realise it's the right thing to do. So this is actually quite an important piece of work. It's a standard setting body for the world. Now, when you think about that, you sort of go, oh, that might be quite important, and indeed it is. Right, it's still coming through. It's been consulted on this year. Jane Maui and lots of other people have been involved in it. But watch this space, because then this sets the standard for others to have to try to meet its obligations. It's always the coalition of the willing. The willing get on board really, really early, and then suddenly other people go, oh, maybe we should too. So it's creating a type of momentum, and local context has been really behind a lot of that. So for me, provenance, and this is its definition: ownership, custody, or location. All right, so and that's from Wikipedia, because actually when I looked at some of the definitions, it's as good as any. And actually, Wikipedia is not a bad organisation, because it too is a not-for-profit. And then you can think about provenance as being spatial, social, geography, and history. Okay, so provenance isn't just origin, it comes with a whole context. So how does all that relate to value? Okay, so I'm going to now think about the economy. So we have the Māori economy is a thing in New Zealand. We quantify it, and this is a little bit old, but you get the idea. And it depends on particular types of capital. That's a very economic term, and you can call it something else, but I'll just use the economics words. So it's natural capital, i.e. stuff in the ground, and the stuff that you've been talking about before, and lots of people are talking about human capital, i.e. our own capabilities, our social, our financial, and our physical. And we would also say our spiritual, okay, our cultural, but this is normally how they talk about it, okay? And if you know anything about capital, it loves to go around everywhere else, not here. So a lot of capital has been drawn: financial capital, human capital, i.e. the stuff we have in our heads, which is also called IP. We've talked about copyright, okay, but when thinking about biological resources, that's patenting, all the stuff that at a global UN level, and with some of those intellectual property agreements have really irked Indigenous peoples globally for many years, hence local context finding a place to sidestep it, if you like. So capitalism is global and it really relies on infrastructure, actually pipes, actually cables, electricity. Some of that is on your Indigenous lands or it's going over our skies. So capitalism loves digital. And we only need to look around the world to see how capitalism has merged into almost what I'd call an oligopoly, 2 or 3 big players, and they got it all, right? Okay, that's why I like local context, because it's like, let's find our way around that. And so to me, it is this Indigenous infrastructure. Why is that useful? So provenance is important because it tells us about, it links our relationships to the data, whether it's a tangible material resource or intangible. I talked about that. So what does this mean for the Māori economy? Well, I think it's an exemplar of how to embed provenance-based Indigenous relationships, and whether those are social, cultural, spatial, temporal, geographic, spiritual, into capitalism's digital infrastructure. Now that sounds sort of radical, and I actually think it is. It's actually taking capitalism head on, but saying, okay, we can't beat Meta. We can't beat Amazon. They got all the capital in the world. And actually a lot of it's ours, to be perfectly honest. So that's why I really mihi to you, because I think that's the space you're moving into. So let's go around it. Let's not find an obstacle, because here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I think we're going through an Empire Strikes Back moment. Right? But what happened after that? The Return of the Jedi. So I'm sort of feeling that this is like we're on that planet over there, but we're marshalling our resources. So that to me is where the why this to me is quite a radical response to capitalism's natural bent to want to own everything. Okay, and interestingly enough, when we're thinking about AI, because Kandy was talking about AI, this is a very recent paper about can AI be more explainable and trustworthy? And if you see these areas here, provenance plays a huge part of it. And that is exactly the space where local context is placing itself, in this trustworthiness and ethics side. So again, I think it's the right tool for the right time. So coming back to economics, we know that 1 in 3 Māori jobs depend on agriculture, forestry and fishing, and eDNA. Man, that's totally in that space. And Māori who work in export firms earn more than those in non-export. So these are areas, because capital is global, and Māori, we also want to be part of that, but not at the expense of all those other things. How do we, it's not have your cake and eat it too, but it's how do we govern that ethically, responsibly and within our own contexts. So these are some areas, and I've just come back from the Federation of Māori Authorities conference last week. And can I tell you that the iwi people there, they were going, we want AI, we want drones because we're already using them, we want robots because they're picking our kiwi fruit, right? So there is no fear on the part of many of our iwi organisations or our trust organisations of technology. And in fact, it is how do we get it, how do we use it, but how do we use it to create benefit coming back? So here are areas that are picked to be the next best thing for Aotearoa New Zealand, okay? And you'll see every single one of those are on our lands. There's nothing there that's not on our lands. Okay, so that brings me back to this. All of that future focus is right there at home. So how do we take advantage of that without selling our souls, without losing what makes us who we are as iwi people? So I think provenance is more important than ever, particularly in global context, because there is a shift in what the world wants. And this is something that one of the KPMG directors talked about. So instead of thinking about the final mile, how do you get that last product into the consumer? Actually, what the consumer wants to know is what's the first mile. That is our space. That is the space that Indigenous people can own, because we've already got all the answers. We've worked through all the really, really hard stuff, and we can stand by that. So what would that look like? Well, it's Indigenous provenance, and it's embedding in global data infrastructures. It's an opportunity to create value and share benefit in lots of different domains. We've been talking in the research domain and institutional domain, but as soon as you talk about publishers, they're commercial. They are billion-dollar industries, and they've been sucking it out of not only researchers, but many Indigenous people as well. All right, so this is actually a challenge into the commercial sector. And I'm really pleased that those conversations are happening with the billion-dollar companies, because if you can get billion-dollar companies on your side, you are starting a global conversation everywhere. Maybe not with Meta or Google. I don't know about them. Some people have been working with them, all right? But or Microsoft, which is the software that's an AI, all of that was generated by an AI PowerPoint presentation. But if we start somewhere, that's the opportunity. Okay. So what will this look like? It's going to look like something there, all right? And the two rangatahi that are here, and I really mihi to them. One of those is our archivist, deep, doing that provenancing work, putting in that the metadata. But one is one of our te reo experts, and he's saying he's not an expert. Well, he's better than me. All right, so that seems expert, but also in our digital area in gaming. Okay, so that's an international multi-billion-dollar industry, and we are moving into, okay, so what could local context and the sort of work that Kandy's doing or others are doing, what could that offer that space? What could that offer this space, this is our, like I said, our perfume that came from here. How can we use the sorts of infrastructure and the thinking behind local context to actually bring benefit back to or create value from that which has been handed down from our ancestors? So kia ora koutou, ngā mihi.
Thank you, everyone.
Share the microphone.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Maui is out in the audience for any questions. Does anybody have anything right away? Please.
My context in Kandy, as far as the AI stuff, the speech side of it, recognizing speech and stuff, how are you working towards getting that working with Te Reo Māori and those kind of things? There's a lot of, the best stuff, at least for us, is that hidden field that's, sometimes we don't even understand it. So how do you train a model to work with that when, a lot of that knowledge has been lost for generations or, those kind of things.
Yeah.
So for the speech recognition side, so we take care of the visual side, for Te Reo Māori, we are going with Te Hiku Media. We're collaborating with them because they already specialise in this area. We created a Te Reo Māori speech recognition application. So there was no point in us creating that as well. So we collaborate with them because they're my Whānaunga. So we work with them for the speech side. We use their API. And also we just created a prototype for dual language. So both English and Te Reo Māori.
We tested that with Radio Ngāti Parau on one of their content, and it's really strong in Te Reo Māori. It was quite accurate. The English side was still struggled a bit, but that's their strength, and so that's why they were up on our thank you board just to commit to them. So that's really their forte, and we're going into the visual side because that side is not really explored enough for us. So that's the market that we're in. Does that answer your?
Thank you, Kandy. Anyone else? I have one for Katharina. Is that correct? So in my own academia, I study a lot of cultural landscapes and study a lot of culture geographers, and in particular Ifu Tuan, who stated that space plus culture equals place. And as you're working with Indigenous communities, looking for provenance, what kind of mechanisms are you using to drill down and get to their sense of place and identifying that knowledge in that way?
I can only work in my space. So to do that, and I want to make to Rose too, because one of the issues I think as academics is that am I doing an interview with my own people? It just feels weird. Okay, so it's like how do I work with our own people and then collectively say, yeah, that's cool for us. That's exactly how we think about it. So I guess looking for ways of working in my own space. That to me, do I need to work with other people in their spaces in a global effort? Yes, you do. However, you're not the centre of their world. So I guess it's always finding those the types of relationships that make sense to work on whatever it is that you're trying to work on. I don't know if that's answering your question.
Yeah.
But to me, space, space is like a spatial aspect to it, which goes up to the sky and down to everything in between. And when we're thinking about this context, local context takes in all of that. Right, so from the eDNA to physically the mountains and to the people. So how do we take account of that as space and then honour that, but also then say, all right, we don't want others to be coming into our space or our place and always benefiting. So how do we have that conversation? What does it look like, and how do we provide markers? And for us, physically we might have a big code or a big pole that would say this is our place and this is our space. So I think what local context is trying to do is do something similar, but at the micro and invisible level sometimes, but also in the IP level, which I think many of us struggle to get our heads around, but then others in the legal system have got it covered and they've been ahead of you for 400 years. So sometimes it does feel like catch up.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah. Thank you all. I have a question about the tracking the eDNA, and I'm just wondering, is there a system in place to know that collection has occurred? So is there a permission access system that lets you know the eDNA samples been collected?
Very good question. Not yet, but it's certainly something that Border Lab for the examples in Aotearoa that there's a willingness to do that, and whether it's based off a similar model that Aaron talked about with bringing the native lands, kind of layering in to be able to do that. But it's one aspect, and again, we've been talking about the relationships. It's more important that the relationships are established and there, and that we know that the work is being done, the reasons why, and things like that. So it's having it's being able to have really good relationships with the likes of the Department of Conservation, Northern Regional Council for us, obviously, Biosecurity New Zealand. More important to establish those and understand the intent and the use of the methodology. But I think it's important, you know, for we're now seeing instances of eDNA samples coming in and some botanists that want to work with us looking for you know, significant things like, you know, threatened species and things like that, you know. So there are other applications to think of. And in order to do kind of that well, you know, you create that, you've created that link by having the eDNA sample there, but as it creates more work and more projects and more potential to upskill and build information with that, what's happening in there, like it's the key is really those relationships and knowing. The one thing that I really like about it is well, with the local context label is, you know, there's enough literature on who we all are and where we exist and what our areas are and hence the provenance. But one thing that I'm more sort of really mindful of is people, how they access that and whether they're coming through the front door to have a conversation with us about the intent and use of the projects they're trying to do. So, you know, being mindful of that. The system isn't quite there yet, but more importantly, the relationships are pretty solid, and they will get better. And I think as we become more familiar and it's just normalised, as we talked about before, that will improve as well.
Can I just add to that about coming through the front door? Because I think that's super important. And those of you that are staying in the hotel in town will have in your bathrooms a product called Huia. I know to break it out of the bathrooms this morning. But it strikes me, and so Huia, that's clearly Māori language. In this country, Māori language is now second, not first. But that's another story. But its contents contain colour, and I think something else, and I can't read it. I haven't got my glasses on it. Now, this particular company is biodegradable and all the rest of it, trying to do good things. No one had a conversation about using that language. No one had a conversation about using those ingredients. Okay, so this is what I mean. Other people have jumped on so many of our haunga, our precious things, and are benefiting, and this all up to this company, but we don't see it. So I guess imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. We have tools now to be able to have conversations.
I'm not here to kick you off. I'm just like scared here. I was trying to see if there's any more questions out there. I was going to say that, so just alongside the eDNA, there is also Maine, the University of Maine, that's doing kind of Project Maine eDNA, working alongside the Wabanaki communities as well. But I think what we're going to see is just more and more of these sorts of monitoring activities. eDNA is just an example of them. There's going to be all sorts of other ones. You're all collecting data that is about our spaces. And it's, how do you put that sort of marker on it? It says, this is from our place, and we've got an interest in what's happening to it. And because it's going to be happening at such a volume, how do we make use of those AI tools to kind of keep some kind of management of what's going on, so we can get to the place where Kathleen was talking about. Yeah. Karen?
Can I just
Just with regards to that. With regards to that, has anyone spoken to iNaturalist about the amount of data that's being collected and collated in that platform?
Not yet. Not yet. It's certainly something beyond that. But I was just going to start on the back of what he was saying, Mo, and actually your presentation as well about publications. But recently, we've had a lot of work, obviously, in the white pole forests over the last few years around the Kandy eye disease. But one of the things that recently kind of put into action is that we've been working with some PhD students, and I was lucky enough to attend a what's it? It was a PhD. Was it a notification presentation or something? Basically, they were sitting there. They had to defend their thesis, what they were doing. But one of the things that I asked for, because the thesis leans very heavily on a lot of the work that we have been leading in that space. So I did ask of the university for co-ownership of the PhD, and they agreed at that meeting. So I don't know if it's going to be ripple effects further from that. I'm not really interested, but I got an agreement around the table, and that's a good enough indication to me. So, and obviously the labels are very heavily involved in that as well. But I just thought I could push my luck and see how we went, and we went all right. So, good. Good.
I have just one last question, and that's for Kandy. And as you're engaging with the TK labels and working with AI, one thing that we found at Penobscot was there were situations where the TK labels weren't sufficient. The suite of them, we needed something else. Have you found that they're sufficient at this point, or is there a label you would like to consider as you move forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't thought about another label yet. What I was appreciative of this morning was Renee's talk on idea, and just the thought that's gone into the design, because I have to say that design is everything. And for the AI to be able to recognise the labels, it's a lot easier. It's like us. The bigger the label, the easier it is to see and to recognise. The smaller it is, the more challenging it is for the AI to recognise. So just seeing the thought process that's gone into the design, especially when it's small. But I personally haven't thought of any other labels, but you plant the seed. And one thing that Jane pointed out to me when we first met, which was just in February, was she wanted me to put the labels into our training data sets. And so that's what my researchers will be instructed to do. So that's just the importance of having Māori around the table at these developments is really important. Having Indigenous people at this table.
Thank you all. Go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to the chamber question. One of the hats that I wear is as the technical representative of GBIF for New Zealand. The hope is, so there's been recently Maui's presentation in Tasmania understands that he was kind of really key in Henderson, and we're really interested in what they're doing and what we've done at Manaki Whenua with the collections that I'm looking to learn from what started there. My hope is that things like GBIF, and by getting them on board and the Atlas of Living Australia and things are all, they're all key as work items in the draft work plan for like the GBIF for this year around care principles and how they might incorporate this stuff into their infrastructure. So it's kind of leading and getting that coalition as willing again to actually provide those examples, and then I think you'll find that there'll be a high reception or high adoption by the likes of our naturalists in New Zealand anyway, and those things.
Thank you. Let's
Yes, thank you. We're going to take a 20-minute break. There's more coffee and tea and water. So please help yourself. Yeah, and we'll be back.
Thank you. Well done, by the way.
3:40.
Why it's in that way.
the final session. So yeah, welcome. No. Yeah, I wasn't sure where I was going with that, but it's just the last session before we go to the film screening. But actually, it's been it's actually really interesting. And so particularly that last session, just seeing where things are going. So Taoho and Kandy, they were a part of the local context training at the beginning of the year, and all of a sudden they just go away and come back with something. And it's pretty amazing to see, just sort of like the innovation and things that our communities have to just make stuff happen. And Rose too. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and Rose.
Great trainers.
Yeah, that's right. All of these things that just sort of emerge. And one of the things that we've also been working on alongside is the different kind of agencies. Both of them have been providing funding in support of initiatives and support of communities getting involved in the labels, but just in terms of that sort of discussion, awareness raising, advocacy type work as well. So we just wanted to have a sort of a final little bit of a panel for that conversation to take place. Xavier here from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, Lane from Te Puni Kōkiri, and Cass from Sairo. So I'm going to ask them just a start off question, something to just give some opening reflections and comments on things that they've heard today and just sort of general thoughts about where local context is at. And then I'm going to open it to the floor. So I'm giving you some time to think about your question. Don't make me call you out. We just want it to flow. Okay? So kia ora. Xavier, kicks off.
Yes. Oh, I thought you were going to ask me a question.
No. Just sort of kind of opening.
I was going to tease it out.
Reflection.
Okay. Nō reira tēnei mihi a koutou, kua huihui mai tēnei wā, e whakahira te kaupapa o ngā labels. Nō reira tēnei mihi a koutou. Hiri au no Ngāti Raukau, Ngāti Tuaranga Tira, me Ngāti Huia. Nō reira, pai te tiki tā ia koutou. Good to see a lot of the faces here from the training as well as the other things. I was really happy to see that you ladies had got your funding from, who was it? Corporate? Oh, yeah, Kandy, yeah. Te Puni Kōkiri, that's really exciting. So congratulations to you. I just wanted to say that on the way through. But so my role at the Ministry for Culture and Heritage as a principal advisor dealing with funding around traditional knowledge projects. And I suppose also, full disclosure, have a role at Te Kotahi Research Institute as a research fellow. So that's about me. But that's just about me, and I think we'll follow up with the quarterly.
Okay. Kia ora tātou, tēnei mō monuri mō kātari hoki, ko Lane Fisher tōku ingoa, he kākata ko o Te Puni Kōkiri. So I'm manager at Te Puni Kōkiri, focusing on policy and from the deep dark south and also out of the Kahu ways. That's what you do there? Sure.
My name is Cassandra. I'm a senior research manager at CSIRO. And I'm also an executive on the Maori Wakara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective in Australia. And my role at CSIRO is the Indigenous Research Grants, where we provide funding to communities through our internal researchers to support Indigenous needs and priorities, as well as we're starting to develop and look at our internal policies around Indigenous data and what Indigenous data sovereignty may look like within CSIRO, and that includes the TKBC labels. And I'm also a proud Mora Warrior woman.
just keep holding on to it. Just keep holding on to it, and then we'll bring it all the way back. So, what's excited you most about today?
I don't really know where to start because there's been so many amazing speakers and also projects. And within CSIRO, we do everything from electronics, AI, all the way through to environmental. And so everything today, was just really mind-blowing to see the diversity in the labels and where we can apply those. So Louisa and I have got very excited on all of this today. And it's like we need to map out actually where we can make the most impact to start with and how we can start socialising the labels within our organisation. And we have around probably over 6,000 staff within CSIRO. And so, yeah, that's really exciting because, there's so many different ways that we can apply. And we've also got national collections, which have 7 different types of collections. So it was amazing to hear the work that's been going on. And sometimes when we look at our collections and the TKBC labels, it's kind of like, wow, where do we actually start? So today, seeing how it was broken down into bite-sized chunks, how it was made fit for purpose for communities, how community were invited in. So there's lots of shared learnings and within our team as well. So we've got Alona who's here. Alona, just pop your hand up. So Alona is the science director for the National Collection. So reach out to Alona and also Brittany. Brittany is the project manager on that project as well. So reach out to her if you want to do some collaborations or sharing. But yeah, it's such a wonderful day. Thank you.
Kia ora no. So my morning was spent in the party, which I think I could, we're 24 hours into a new government. So as you would have seen, there's a lot of kind of rhetoric and media and whatnot. And as public servants at the moment, it's really about trying to put that to one side and trying to think about actually what are the key policy changes that this government's looking to do and how do we maximise the benefit in terms of te puni kōkiri for Māori. So that's what our focus is, and it's always our focus. So my team is in charge of, I guess, 2 main things. One is focused on the cultural and intellectual property policy elements for which our government's responsible for, but also in terms of the system leadership across government around Mātauranga Māori and thinking about how do we pick up and address a lot of the Y262 issues that went through the tribunal. And so in that regard, we're really thinking about this is an opportunity to, I guess, shine some light on where Māori are really strong and I actually touched on some of that around the provenance and where those economic benefits can come. And so there's a lot of good stuff already happening in there. And so I guess the framing I'd give for my morning was around trying to see the kind of slower constitutional kōrero that we often have as a society, whether it's in Aotearoa, New Zealand, whether it's in our cousins across the ditch or further afield, where some of these things, they jump back and forward, as Katarina touched on, that things swing and sway. But actually what happens, and this is my afternoon here, is around the things just keep happening at that cutting edge and we just get on with it and we do the mahi and we show the impact and we take the opportunities in front of us. So I guess I feel empowered in that sense that we've still got these great shining lights that are really at the cutting edge and driving these kaupapa forward and showing the value. When I say value, that kind of holistic value as well. So thank you.
I suppose part of the excitement of being here is seeing our own iwi hapu and related organisations and entities coming up with Indigenous ways to reassert themselves and their claims on what's effectively theirs but not recognised as theirs. And part of the excitement, sort of in a parallel way in government the last few years, is being able to do things for particularly for marae, actually, right at the ground level of our communities, and seeing the vast web of kind of aspirations that our marae have for themselves and for all of their taonga and everything in their rohi. So everything across their territory, obviously being in the arts, culture and heritage space, it's it's been more about those cultural projects, although it always sort of bleeds over into the environmental when you're Māori. But it's quite clear that even at this base level of marae, which, as we know, are generally not resourced, have very little manpower hours to after their day jobs to get things done. There's still all of these projects coming out of the ether around iwi data archiving. One of mine, but I got funded and done it, and they just put a website up the other day, and it's really impressive. That 3 years ago they weren't even on Marae Facebook. It was still, phone a friend on the kumana line to let anyone know that things were happening. So there's a lot happening there, and a huge kind of spectrum of projects in every different sort of form of mātauranga. Revitalisation. The biggest challenge is succession, and succession is a person-to-person thing. It's a kanuhi ki te kanuhi. It's a kaumātua ki ngā rangatahi thing. And these projects, and part of the challenge of being in government when we're looking at funding these projects, is what is going to be sustainable. And when I'm saying these projects, particularly the digital side, the electronic side of all of the projects that marae have. And they're definitely not afraid of technology. But there's this issue where technology goes at such a speed nowadays that what's here today might be gone tomorrow. And so, it's kind of an issue. It's an issue that we're looking for solutions to. And where traditional knowledge labels fits inside all of this is that it's not in itself a new kind of end product. It's an intermediary way for iwi hapu to assert their claims on their material. And so the idea being that the end product will keep changing every 3 to 5 years in the technological cycle, all these things coming through around NFTs and VR headsets, which already people are sort of somewhat shying away from. But this middle section is a really important space where I think that like in terms of the public investment sense, we can see value and lasting sustainable value. The last thing is around our national collections. So I work with Te Papa Heritage New Zealand, Pauhere Taonga, National Libraries, Archive New Zealand, Alexander Turnbull Library. I'm probably forgetting someone else. Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision. Thank you, Emma. And we funded one pilot with Whakatūia for the traditional knowledge labels, and which was the first one. And these organisations are actually openly looking for partners so that they can figure out a way of applying labels to their collections. So if you or anyone is in that space where they feel that they can commit, they've got a project with one of these agencies, like which iwi wouldn't have an interest in National Libraries collection? I mean, one way or another they will. But it's about having that time and the right person who can act as an interface between those two worlds. Contact me basically. I can put you in touch with these agencies, and they are keen to work on these things. But until we have the right person in the right place, it's difficult for them to go forward, because they want to take their lead from iwi in this space and not kind of invent their own way of doing things. And the last thing is my little example here is with our Anne-Marie Gillies over there and friends from Waimarama. So they'll be talking to you tomorrow about reclaiming their archaeological information in the New Zealand Archaeological Association database, which is a partnership project we've got going with them. And really, that's that comes about because there's one person, in this case, Anne Marie, who was connected and willing and able to set up a project. So that's what it comes down to. And so that's my advertising too. If you know of someone, the agencies are keen, let me know.
Can I say that? Any questions? A question before I go back to asking another question? No? Yes? No? Was that a hand up there? No? Okay. It's like, I hope this is what's not going to be like at my auction in a couple of weeks. So next question. So where would you like to see the labels? Where would you like to see the labels in 5 years? Any particular places you think would be cool to see them turn up?
Well, National Library, Archives New Zealand, all the places. So I'm on the sort of cultural side of mātauranga space, and all the places that I've done research before. They're these vast databases with, nice website interfaces, or bad ones in some cases. But a lot of them are getting modernized at this point in time, so it's an ideal point of time to go in while the systems are being updated and get your tohu on there. For your iwi, your hapu, but that's just one example.
I'm always about kind of where are the edges of things and trying to think about how far is too far and where we draw lines. And I guess for me, in any projects, you start seeing those quite quickly. But in this one, I can't see it yet, and I'd be quite interested to see where this goes. And thinking about really Western databases like your birth, deaths, and marriages in New Zealand. What's the role of labels there, for example? Because you can look at that and that's whakapapa, right? So how do we recognise that? And because anyone can just pick that up, because that's after 50 years, I think, DNA friends there. You can basically just go in there and scroll up and see where people were born, and you can pick up some things, and it shows, often very racist kind of commentary on the people. And that's your tupuna there, and that's how they conceptualise as your tupuna. So how do we change that? And how do we get some labeling around that sort of stuff? So that's a kind of how I've been thinking about it.
Thanks very much. I guess Louisa, you hand up as well. So it's Louisa, she's our exec manager, and Louisa and I have been talking a lot today about just the application of this, like I said before, but our publishing system. So we've got Cyro Publishing. I'd really love to see that there. But we've also got a data depository. And I know that there's a lot of care work been going on in the care principles. So I'd really love to see that sort of happen there. But I really think from that publication facing outwards, I think that'd be really great. And then another thing that we've been talking about today as well is that Cyro do a lot of commercialisation. So we work with a lot of mold to produce products like Native Secrets, Okasan, Uncle Charlie's, food and stuff. And so it'd be really great to see those labels being applicable onto those commercialised products. Starting soon, I think one of the Uncle Charlie's is actually looking at province and tracking that from the start to the finish, and also looking at the business development side of things and how much of that return of investment is going back to community. So I think that would be a really great area to add in those labels along that product's journey.
Keep hold of it there. And I guess one of the things we've been saying is that as we go along is that the labels aren't sort of fit for purpose for everything. They do something particularly well, but there's other tools and things that are needed. Like, just have you got a sense of like what are the things that need to be used alongside the labels to create better Indigenous control of things?
Well, probably the care principles, obviously, like using that alongside, having that really great metadata schema that you mentioned that you guys have been working on with the IEEE, and also with Enrich and GITA as well. I think it's not just one tool. I think you need to look at it as a package and a system change approach, and then it's all those policies to support that change, as well as the capability building. Like, I think that's a really important aspect And that's one of the things that we're doing quite well, building a whole new workforce of people at CSIRO. And I think in that data capability space that Nathan touched on today is a really important factor, not only for the Indigenous community, but also for non-Indigenous communities, particularly to gather those allies so that they know, hang on, this should really sit with community, this is community's rights, this is their ownership. And having those allies along the way to support us in our journey, I think is really important.
I think you're probably talking about relationships there. So I was thinking about, at Te Puni Kōkiri, we think about the kind of a value chain in a sense of a potama, and thinking about taking the concept or the mātauranga into a research space, and then taking it into, once you've done your research, understanding of the taonga of mātauranga, thinking about then what is the development approach, making sure you've got authenticity and integrity throughout that, and then taking that into, if it's the marketing or how you're communicating with the person who's going to get your goods and services, and then the person who then holds the taonga and has that at the end. So you could take that through from a pounamu, from the kind of concept of the pounamu right through to the wearer of the pounamu, or something like we've now got our Matariki holiday, and thinking about how do we ensure that concept holds its integrity and authenticity throughout that value chain. Because we want to celebrate those sorts of things, but how do we do that appropriately? So then you see the potential, the McDonald's almost putting up the Matariki Big Mac and knowing, actually, hang on, we look at the value chain there, that's not what we're going for. But there's probably some products that we can say, actually, that represents Matariki. That's a cool product, and people want to buy that and can see the integrity and authenticity throughout that. So at Te Puni Kōkiri, we think about that, and what are those structures then, and what is government's role in each of those steps is what we're thinking about. And how do we ensure that provenance, that integrity throughout? And I think as government, we need to partner with iwi and hapu and whānau on that, and we need to figure out what those things are. But in terms of active protection, a lot of it is just making sure we have the system settings in place to make sure that people can't pass off products, goods and services as being something they are not, but also enabling Māori to be able to benefit from their mātauranga as appropriate. And that comes in all shapes and forms, of course, but I guess that's how we've been thinking about it.
I suppose I enjoyed the mentions earlier, particularly that Katrina Brixton made about provenance, because that is also a way into the whole capitalist and commercialist ideology, and it is a way to connect all of this mahi in the cultural space to, I suppose, all of that sphere of endeavour, which is where the power is, because that's where the money is. That's one thing. But the other thing is, I suppose, provenance is really important. It makes me think about the first time it really struck me was going to Thames, Ngāti Maru, with those po along the side of that bridge going into the town. And I was like, wow, I know I'm in Ngāti Maru Urui now. These big, totem pole like po on the side of the bridge, and in a way that's sort of what labels are. They don't mean that you're now legally in Ngāti Maru policed territory or anything like that, but it has real impact on the way people see it, and so for example, our Archaeological Association project, one of the things that makes it important is because archaeological sites are protected by law in New Zealand. It's quite strict. It's pre-1900, at least in theory, and anything under the ground that's pre-1900 is potentially an archaeological site. And so these tohu, these po around the whenua have ramifications for working with the powers that be at local authorities, district councils, district planning mechanisms, and as we've seen some other examples today, that's what goes through. But so I suppose what needs to come alongside these labels is capability for iwi to be able to engage in these processes, capability for iwi to be able to go beyond putting the tohu on and then being able to have someone at the end of the line when they call up and say, hey, we want to research partner with you around this, or there's a development happening there and they're about to go in with the diggers. What does it mean that your name is associated with this? And that requires capability for iwi, and there's a big piece of work there for government to get its head around in terms of how we can support iwi in this space, as well as iwi themselves, obviously Ngāpuhi marae. In what ways can we grow our capabilities so that we can more effectively assert our rangatiratanga around the rohe. The last thing I think that can go along with these, alongside the labels, which is good, would be good to see, is the collaboration with agencies, government or private or academic, that have a lot of expertise to offer in this spaces of how the labels actually apply into reclaiming this knowledge information. And that's something that I've been privileged to witness in the taonga space with the aforementioned agencies, particularly through this program that's centered on revitalisation of mātauranga Māori, of Māori traditional knowledge. And that is like whakairo conservation. There are very, very few people, and all of the taonga inside the wharenui, inside our marae, there are very few people who have that expertise. In some cases, it's one or two who basically should be retired that are sticking around because we need them. And so that's part of that equation in terms of we need to build the capability. In that case, it's actually in government agencies. It's Māori staff in government agencies. There is some work to do there to ensure that we don't end up without, having to send things taonga overseas, our own treasures, to get them conserved or preserved. Yeah.
Kia ora. We have a question. Oh, we have two questions. Okay, Katarina, you're first, and then Dickie, you're second.
Kia ora, you're all funded directly through the government. Is that true for the CSIRO? Yeah. Okay. What are you seeing are the risks or the barriers in doing this sort of work within your organisations? Because I'm just very mindful that Indigenous people working inside mainstream organisations often face barriers and are often at the edge of some pretty tricky conversations. So what do you think are the barriers for you, maybe personally, but also more generally within your organisation?
Questions?
One of them is public communication.
I think one of the barriers again comes back to that capability building and the understanding. So like we've been talking a lot about how do we socialise this with our non-Indigenous scientists and also community, like bringing community up to speed. I think that's one of the barriers. Funding, like where are we going to get the funds for this? This is a great idea, great initiative, but even within SIRO, if we want to get a great initiative up, like title sovereignty or anything like that, we still have to apply for funds within our own organisation, which then gets assessed and usually not assessed by Aboriginal panel. So there's a barrier there. So I think there's little things like that. And then for me personally, because I also work in my community, and our collections hold with IACSIS. And IACSIS isn't coming to the party about what TKBC labels are or how we can govern Indigenous data properly. So I think just those things, and even the definition around what Indigenous data is. A lot of people, or non-Indigenous people particularly, don't see Indigenous data how we see it, and that's from our worldview and our perspective, because we don't see, forests or trees as being separate to us. We're a part of all living things in our now. So I think that's where the barriers for me.
I think I've got the blessing it's really cool here is that nearly 80% of the employees are Māori, so we have the common connection there, and then for usually quite a strong common understanding of what we're trying to do, and so it takes away that energy, I guess, where we have to kind of get people to that level of understanding. I won't talk about the broader public service yet, where we're growing our capability there, but I think the key thing for us in Ngāti is more around how do we show the impact or the outcomes of the mahi? What does that look like? And how do we start putting some numbers around it, or even some really good qualitative information around it, and starting to really, I guess, triangulate between te tiriti, some really good data and insights, and also for government, what makes sense for government. What does good governance look like? So it's really the push probably to that other part of that tapatoru in terms of that data and insights bit that we really need to grow and really need to strengthen these types of kaupapa to then show that impact. Then it's kind of undeniable.
Yeah, so communication is a big thing because you're having to translate between the priorities of the Crown and legislation and what Māori communities want. That's not an easy job for anyone, and it's not. There's nothing straightforward about it in terms of being able to achieve positive outcomes as a result of this kind of business of cultural translation, cross-cultural translation. And I think that having a new government after having a few, 6 years of one hue and switching to the other is like a whole new challenge of communication. And obviously this is for all government departments across every time there's a new government, but it's particularly so for when it comes to issues in Te Ao Māori. We've got to find a new vocabulary, a new way of justification. You might have heard of Treasury's wellbeing framework here in New Zealand, which was kind of world leading, and now potentially we're looking at some other way of having to communicate what is important to Māori and what is how the Crown sees its role in this area. So, I mean, that's just a way of looking at it.
Kia ora, Dickie.
Kia ora tātou. Ngā mihi kia koutou, kia kōrua Lane and Fisher. In part, you've answered the question, but I'm going to answer the question anyway. Today, we've seen a lot of hapu marae that are present here. They want to get on the journey of understanding and building their own capability within the TK labels in the BC space. So you've talked about impact, and you've talked about value chain, and you've talked about value and sustainability. And the reality here is, a lot of our whānau that are in communities who want to progress this important kaupapa. What's your thinking on a collaborative approach, interagency approach around building that sustainability for those other, for all of us, or any iwi or hapu or marae that wants to pick this tool up, because there's been a lot of work done in this space. And so I'm really wanting to hear what's your long-term or your picture, respecting the change in government and the policy. but what is it personally that you could see that will assist a lot of our whānau progress down this track?
I won't double dip. I think there's a lot we can do. It's about where do we start, and our view as Te Whene Kōkiri has been that the foundations need to be in a really clear legal system. We need to address the potential harm first and get in protection mechanisms first to enable appropriate use. Because the moment we, the horse is bolted, we're never going to get it back in. And many horses have already bolted, and we can't take a taonga by taonga approach. We actually need to think about the broader system here and try and get in place, sui generis legislation that says if thou shall want to use Mātauranga Māori, there are some steps that need to be in place before you do that, and empower iwi and hapu and whānau to be able to do that. And from there, we then would be looking to build on it and looking at those other tools that government can put in place. And Xavier talked about the capability angle, but we need to find sustainable ways to grow that so that Māori can lead that, because it can't be the government coming out every year and then the funding drops and then comes back up. What we actually need to do is actually enable Māori to create that sort of sustainable approach. If I look across government, one of the places that's just starting to work is in the rongoa space, and thinking about how government is starting to interface with rongoa, but also empower tohunga to actually kind of grow the next generation, but also grow the knowledge of how to interact with the government in those spaces. So I think there's a lot we can learn already that's going on around Mātauranga Māori, and not to lose sight of some of those things.
Can I just respond
Yeah,
to that? There's more emphasis on those outside of government agencies just to assist, and I agree with that. But I'm trying to find a way where there is visual influencer, that can enable whānau and hapu to come together. So I'm really saying, what else can you do interagency that can assist whānau who are probably already trying to do? So that's in terms of your influence space.
Yeah, I'm keen to hear is what I would say. And one of the steps we've been taking to date is we've been working with Tamata Whakapuma, which is the descendants of the original claimants of Y262 kaupapa, to start really taking that journey around making sure that all that has been learnt over the last, 30-something years from that kaupapa, from those 6 iwi, and broadening that approach out so we can take a hapu and iwi-led approach. So we're kind of all ears on that, and I think working through Iwi Chairs Forum has shown us that it's around how do we prioritise in some of those spaces, and we got chucked under Taoho in NICF, and which meant that a lot of our korero was focused on what is that economic outcome, and therefore we kind of put in front, okay, well, what we can do is the system changes, what are those other things? So I guess it's an ongoing korero, I guess, and I'm really keen to keep it going and hear from you if you think there's some really good opportunities that we can do that. And across government, it's around making sure, and Xavier touched on it earlier as well, it's like at the moment we're just relying on the good people in government. We're relying on the Xaviers and the Casses and others who kind of stick their neck out sometimes and really push and wear a lot of risk. What we need to do is actually systematise that, so the ceiling becomes the floor essentially, and where we're going. Yeah.
Cool. So pass it to Cass, and I'm going to go. Oh, I got a question. Oh, okay. We'll get the things. Yeah. Last question. Cool. Go. Yeah. Here comes the things.
Kia ora, Rangi, kia koutou. Yeah, thanks. It's kind of connected to the previous question I was just thinking about what Nathan had presented, and it had the triangle with the information, data, knowledge, and that cultural knowledge. And it's just a gut feeling of hearing the language of commodity and capital, like value chain and adding value, and how do we ensure that we're not disconnecting that spiritual dimension of Ngāti and how do we maintain that connectedness, even though the mahi is based on legislation. So do we have, and I'm asking myself too, because I work for the Crown.
Yeah.
That's a big question.
We all get together, so.
Yes. No, I think it's a.
Because there might be guys under the labels at the time. That's what I'm worried about. That's what my head is thinking, that labels might become something that starts to hide that, and it becomes a vehicle for commodifying our knowledge. That's just a thought.
I'd agree. The way that we've thought about it in Te Puna Kōkiri has been that if you do everything in partnership, then the kaitiaki role in that space, if we're enabling that role appropriately, then we're going to be minimising that risk. But if we do full-on government, thinking government knows all the things, then we're gonna do that. So I guess everything in our mind around Mātauranga Māori needs to be in partnership at minimum. Government only has a small role in this space, so how do we enable Māori to actually make that happen? So I guess my aim to that is, if we have labels, then there need to be kaitiaki. You still on? Yeah. Kaitiaki connected to that label, and there needs to be the people there and their knowledge around that. So there's a whole nother system of systems and that sort of thing. So that's how we've kind of thought about it previously.
Come on, that's great. Hand it over. And I'm going, final question. What are you most looking forward to between now and the end of the year? 30 seconds.
I was going to say holidays.
That's a good answer. Maybe it should just be a one-word answer. There you go, holidays. No. That's all.
Yeah, just between now and the end of the year, there's a lot to wrap up, I guess, and a lot to plan for. So I think at the moment, one of the big things that we're looking at doing is a partnership with the university around what the care principles would look like in a research institute and also within our organisation. And so we're looking at finalising the funding commitments, I think, for that project. So I think that's one of the biggest things I'm looking forward to between now and the end of the year. And then also I'll take the opportunity for advertisement as well. So with Indigenous research grants, we also do Indigenous to Indigenous partnerships or funding for that. And so if there's any opportunities today that we can partner on TKPC label development or anything like that, please reach out to myself and Louisa, because we'd really love to see some of the funding go into this really great initiative today.
Spending some time with my whānau. I've got 3 young kids, so actually I'm really looking forward to that. At least the first couple of days. So no, looking forward to that. And then, to be honest, as a public servant, having some clarity from this new government would be great for Te Puna Kōkiri in terms of what are we prioritising, how are we getting on and delivering for Māori. So that's our focus.
I was about to say clarity. I'm also looking forward to my son's birthday tomorrow. Because he's been counting down every day for the last over a month. Apart from that, some clarity would be nice around everything that we're looking at next year in terms of government money, but also it'll be good to catch up with various people just in the silly season, because let's face it, a lot of the rest of the year you just don't really have those opportunities.
And I was about to say the end of our treaty settlement down here in Aotearoa, but it's not going to be. Yeah, it's still another hearing next year. Right. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Oh, kia ora koutou. Thanks very much for doing that. If we can just give a round of applause. Yeah, thanks. Feel free to move out of the way, unless you want to stay there for the input as well. So, look, just in terms of wrapping up, I got a couple of messages. So one is the next big part of the evening is the film screening. The doors for it open at 5:30. That's at the Penthouse Cinema. You should have the details. Check with Kuri down there. The screening itself starts at 6:30, but there's refreshments before that, so feel free to come in and talk and catch up and reflect on Sylvia's question about the spiritual nature of commercializing and where the labels sit in that mix. Just take the chance to say thank you to all of the speakers. In particular, it's been really amazing to be here today. I think we had the welcome at the beginning and Nate talking about those different points and the reflection from James on the summit. And I think I felt like I've been at a summit seeing a whole lot of things going on today. And so we're going to try and gently go down from the summit and hopefully not end up in a swamp somewhere. There might be a bar there, but not a swamp. And it's just been pretty amazing. So I think it'll be nice to just think about where this goes, what's going to happen over the next 12 months when we get the chance to come back again and share sort of stories. And we're doing some of that through local context itself. Kuri put up the different sort of working groups, people trying to stay in touch and support with that sort of peer-to-peer, community-to-community, institution-to-institution sort of networking, working through some of the challenges that come up along the way. So that support will always be there. Are you giving me a message? Messages? No? Anyone? No? Okay, that's good. All right. Just trying to make sure I cover everything off. And just want to just reiterate my thanks to the local context team that have put everything together. We do have training the next couple of days, so there's a number of people who have been here that have come in for that. So we're looking forward for that as well. So we'll see you at IDEA tomorrow for the next couple of days. That'll be great. And with that, just want to kind of close things off here. Me mihi ka tika ki te Aotearoa, te mana whenua, nā rātou noe whakatūwhiringa ahotanga te hui tēnei rā, ahoe no kei te whakakapinga, no reira kia tau ki tātou katoa, te atu whao tō tātou ariki raiti, te aroha o te atua me te whiwhinga teitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake ake, amen. Kia ora everyone.